Deep in the heart of Central Africa lies a chapter of history that was never meant to be revealed, a chapter crafted behind closed doors, praised as philanthropy, and sold to the world as a mission of progress. But beneath the polished speeches and grand promises stood a single man whose ambitions reshaped a nation. King Leopold I of Belgium. He presented himself as a benevolent ruler, a bringer of civilization, a guardian of humanitarian ideals. Yet behind this carefully constructed image, he quietly transformed the Congo Free State into his own private empire. This was not a colony built for the people, it was a vast territory claimed for personal wealth. Hidden behind the mask of charity, Leopold's public message focused on scientific advancement, moral uplift, and the noble duty of guiding others. It sounded righteous, even inspiring, but each promise concealed a truth far more unsettling. His vision for the Congo was not about cooperation or shared prosperity. It was about extraction, control, and the relentless pursuit of profit. In this story, we uncover the contrast between the world's praise and the reality on the ground. We explore how a European monarch managed to convince global powers of his noble intentions, while quietly designing a system that served one purpose: enriching himself at extraordinary human cost. This is not just a tale of a king's hidden ambitions, it is a look at how narratives can be shaped, distorted, and weaponized. And it reminds us why understanding history remains essential today. If you want more powerful stories like this, stories that uncover what textbooks left behind, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring hidden history to light, one chapter at a time. As Leopold's carefully crafted image spread across Europe, an image of a king guided by compassion, science, and lofty ideals, the reality unfolding in the Congo moved in the opposite direction. What began as a promise of progress slowly revealed itself as a system driven by extraction, where entire communities found their daily lives reshaped by demands they had never agreed to and expectations no human being could reasonably fulfill. The vast forests, rivers, and hidden paths of the region became part of a machine designed to supply rubber, ivory, and valuable minerals to distant markets. And with each shipment that left the Congo's ports, the gap widened between the king's polished announcements and the experiences of the people living under his authority. The pressures started subtly. Agents arrived with instructions to organize work, collect resources, and ensure productivity, insisting that this was part of a grand mission to bring development. But the demands increased without warning, and soon local families found themselves required to deliver unrealistic quantities of rubber or other materials, regardless of weather, distance, or the dangers hidden in dense forests. When these quotas were not met, punishment followed. And although European audiences heard stories of discipline or guidance, those living in the Congo understood the deeper truth. Failure to meet expectations often brought consequences intended to intimidate entire communities. Hostages were taken to ensure cooperation. Leaders were detained until quotas were filled. Families lived in constant uncertainty, never knowing when the next demand would arrive or how steep it would be. As the pressure grew, people began to change the way they lived. Villages organized themselves around collecting rubber rather than farming. Families walked long distances into unfamiliar territories searching for vines, leaving their homes for days at a time. The rhythm of life, once centered on harvests, ceremonies, and community bonds, shifted toward meeting the demands of distant markets. The emotional weight of this transformation was enormous. Many described a constant sense of tension in the air, as if the land itself had grown quieter, waiting for the next order or the next patrol. Traditional roles broke down as people struggled simply to meet the daily requirements placed upon them. The environment changed as well. Areas once abundant with natural resources began to show signs of exhaustion. Rubber vines that had thrived for generations were damaged through rushed extraction, making future yields unpredictable. Hunters and artisans who once used ivory sparingly for cultural purposes now saw entire herds driven into decline by the commercial demands of collectors who would never step foot on African soil. Mining sites expanded into riversides and hills, reshaping landscapes that had deep meaning for local communities. The physical world was being altered at the same pace as social life. Through all of this, stories traveled quietly from one village to another, stories of patrols enforcing rules with severity, stories of neighbors taken into custody when quotas fell short, stories of decisions made far away but felt intensely across the region. These stories did not need embellishment. They carried enough weight on their own. They circulated as warnings, reminders, and lessons in survival. For many, each day became a test of endurance rather than an ordinary part of life. Yet despite the mounting pressure, the human spirit proved difficult to contain. People found small ways to resist and protect one another. Families shared information about safe routes through the forest. Communities organized to hide those being sought by agents. And elders held on to cultural traditions, even when gatherings had to be smaller or quieter. These acts, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold, showed that even under immense strain, dignity was not easily erased. And as more stories of resistance spread, they planted early seeds of solidarity that would later grow into a broader movement challenging the system itself. In this way, the Congo Free State became a place where two realities existed side by side. One crafted for international audiences, polished and reassuring. The other lived by millions of people navigating demands that reshaped their land, their routines, and their sense of security. It was here, in the widening distance between the king's narrative and the people's lived experience, that the true nature of the system revealed itself, quietly at first, then unmistakably, as the pressures of forced labor began to transform the entire region. The numbers alone seem almost impossible to comprehend, yet they form the dark undercurrent of everything that unfolded after Leopold's agents seized control of daily life in the Congo. As the demand for rubber and other resources intensified, entire communities found themselves trapped in an escalating cycle of forced quotas and punishment. And the land that had once supported thriving societies began to feel locked in a quiet, relentless suffocation. Travelers who later crossed these villages spoke of abandoned homes swallowed by vegetation, paths left unused, and fields that had once echoed with laughter now eerily still. Families who had lived on the same riverbanks for generations were suddenly fractured by the constant pressure to meet demands that no human body could sustain. And the exhaustion carved itself into the rhythm of life until it became indistinguishable from despair. The loss of life did not erupt in a single catastrophic moment. It unfolded slowly, almost invisibly, as if time itself was wearing people down. Many did not fall to direct violence, but to the ripple effects created by it: fields left unharvested because laborers were taken away, food stores emptying because communities were pushed to the brink, and illnesses spreading through weakened bodies that no longer had the strength to resist. Each village bore witness to the same pattern, repeating endlessly across a territory so vast that news traveled slower than suffering. When someone disappeared, no one knew whether they had been taken, had fled, or had simply collapsed somewhere along a forest path. The uncertainty became a burden, adding an emotional weight to the physical demands already consuming everyone's energy. Mothers who used to carry their children to market now carried the ache of wondering whether their families could survive another season. Leaders who once gathered their people for celebrations found themselves gathering only to count the missing. Even those who attempted to resist, to hide in the forest or escape to distant regions, faced new dangers: lack of food, exposure, and the constant fear of being found. Disease, too, crept into the weakened population, taking advantage of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Illnesses that might once have been survivable became deadly when paired with hunger and exhaustion, and entire families vanished quietly, with no one left to mark their passing. As the years wore on, The demographic collapse became impossible to ignore. Missionaries and travelers who recorded what they saw struggled to find words for the scale of loss, describing deserted villages stretching for miles, orphaned children wandering without direction, and elders who could no longer remember a time when daily life had not been overshadowed by dread. The land, once rich with cultural traditions, storytelling, music, and community gatherings, now felt hollow, as though an entire world had been thinned and stretched until it was close to breaking. The people who remained carried memories that were difficult to voice, because recounting them meant reopening wounds that had never truly healed. The reduction from 20 million to 10 million was not just a statistic. It was the erosion of countless stories, families, and futures. Each missing person represented a promise that would never be fulfilled, a voice that would never be heard again, and a community left incomplete. The survivors walked forward with the weight of knowing that their world had been reshaped not by natural forces, but by human decisions made far beyond their rivers and forests. Their endurance became a quiet testament to resilience, but it also marked the profound cost of an era that had stripped away so much, leaving behind a landscape forever imprinted with the traces of those who had been lost. Long before the population collapse became visible to outside observers, the seeds of it had been quietly planted through agreements that few in the Congo understood, and even fewer had the power to resist. The turning point came when Leopold enlisted Henry Morton Stanley, a man already celebrated in Europe for his expeditions, to open the pathways that would later tighten around the region like a trap. To the world, Stanley was portrayed as a daring adventurer charting unknown rivers and forging connections with distant communities. But in the villages along the Congo River, his arrival carried a different weight. Chiefs welcomed him with the openness customary in many societies that valued hospitality, not realizing that the papers they touched or the marks they made were interpreted thousands of miles away as full surrender of their land, people, and autonomy. The process unfolded in a deceptively smooth manner. Stanley traveled with translators who often softened or altered meanings, presenting agreements as promises of friendship, mutual protection, or access to foreign goods. Chiefs who believed they were participating in symbolic gestures found their names attached to documents that European legal systems would later claim granted Leopold private ownership of nearly all the Congo basin. The imbalance in understanding created an illusion of consent, and by the time the truth became clear, resistance had already been framed as rebellion. What had started as exchanges of trust quickly morphed into the foundation for the forced labor regime that would reshape every aspect of life. Some elders later recalled the confusion of those early meetings, remembering how gifts of cloth and tools were offered as tokens of goodwill, only to realize later that those objects were stepping stones to much heavier demands. As the treaties accumulated, the atmosphere in the villages began to shift. The first signs were subtle: new posts set up near river crossings, unfamiliar symbols carved into trees, and officials arriving with expectations that no one recognized from their traditions. Chiefs who attempted to question the demands were reminded of agreements they barely remembered signing, while those who refused were pressured by force or replaced with others who would comply under duress. The sense of security that had existed for generations started to erode, replaced by a growing unease as people realized that their daily lives were now being shaped by decisions made far beyond their reach. The forests that had always offered safety became spaces of uncertainty, and the rivers that once connected communities now carried the presence of foreign agents who enforced the quotas with unwavering determination. Villagers who had once looked to their leaders for guidance now found them caught between protecting their people and surviving the pressures imposed on them. Some chiefs tried to negotiate, attempting to soften the demands by offering smaller amounts of resources or seeking more time. But these requests were rarely accepted. Others fled into the wilderness with their families, hoping distance would protect them from the tightening grip of the new system. Those who stayed often bore the brunt of the early enforcement, as Stanley's network of stations created the infrastructure needed to monitor, punish, and extract. Each new outpost became a reminder that the treaties were not forgotten pieces of paper, but tools that allowed the outside world to rewrite the region's future without its consent. In time, the villagers began to understand that the agreements had not brought partnership but control, and that the explorers' visits had marked the beginning of a transformation none of them could halt. The once welcomed figure of Stanley faded into a memory overshadowed by the consequences of the signatures he collected. Those documents, crafted far from the forests and clearings where they were signed, became the legal veneer for a system that would drain entire communities. And as the forced labor demands intensified, people could trace the origins of their suffering back to those first moments when trust was exchanged for promises that were never meant to be kept, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape the land and fracture its people for generations. As the deceptive treaties took root and the new structures of authority spread across the region, the weight of Leopold's system soon settled into daily life through the arrival of the Force Publique. A force created not to protect communities, but to ensure absolute compliance with the demands imposed from afar. Villagers who had once relied on their own leaders for guidance now found themselves confronted by uniformed men who represented a power no one had invited. These soldiers moved through forests and river paths with an air of authority that felt foreign and unyielding, carrying with them the expectation that every village would meet the ever-rising resource quotas. What had once been peaceful routines of gathering, fishing, and farming gradually turned into days marked by fear of inspection, fear of failure, and fear of what might follow if demands were not met. The presence of the Force Publique altered the rhythm of life in ways that were difficult to escape. People woke not to the sounds of the river or birdsong but to the possibility of sudden visits, knowing that any shortfall could be interpreted as defiance. Quotas grew more unrealistic with each season, pushing communities far beyond what their environment or bodies could sustain. And as exhaustion became widespread, so did the tension. The soldiers enforced the rules with an iron discipline that left little room for negotiation, and their methods quickly became the unspoken shadow behind every conversation. Even children, who once roamed freely through the fields, learned to recognize the sound of distant footsteps and retreat into hiding places known only to them. Yet the cruelty of the system did not always reveal itself through loud acts. Often it appeared in the quiet aftermath of an unfulfilled quota, in the silence that fell over a home after a confrontation, or in the empty places at evening gatherings where familiar faces no longer appeared. The enforcement of obedience became a tool of psychological domination as much as physical control. Villagers saw how discipline was carried out not only to punish individuals, but to send a message to entire communities, creating an atmosphere in which fear replaced trust and vigilance replaced rest. Families who once found comfort in one another now lived with the burden of wondering who might be taken next or what consequences might fall upon them if they faltered. Some communities attempted to adjust by reorganizing their work, dedicating every spare moment to collecting the required materials in the hope of avoiding confrontation. Others retreated into the forest, creating hidden camps far from the main paths. Though even these refuges were not always safe, the Force Publique expanded its patrols and established outposts deep within territories where few outsiders had ever ventured. People who once thought distance would grant them safety discovered that the reach of the new system extended farther than anyone had imagined. The constant pressure created a silence that settled heavily over the land, as though the forests themselves were holding their breath. Amid all of this, the emotional toll deepened. Elders who had guided their communities for decades felt their authority crumble under the weight of an imposed power they did not understand. Parents struggled to protect their children while meeting demands that stole time, strength, and hope. Stories of enforcement traveled from village to village, carried not in explicit detail but in the tremor of voices and the solemn expressions of those who had witnessed too much. Over time, the Force Publique became not just a military presence, but the embodiment of the system that had descended upon the Congo, a constant reminder that the land, the labor, and even the lives of its people were being monitored, counted, and controlled. In every community touched by this force, the legacy of fear intertwined with the daily struggle for survival. The soldiers may have been the visible arm of the system, but the true power they represented was the structure built through deception, coercion, and unyielding exploitation. Their presence ensured that the treaties signed under false pretenses and the quotas imposed without mercy were not abstract policies, but realities lived out in every household, echoing through generations long after the uniforms disappeared from the forest paths. The arrival of the Force Publique marked a turning point. But the true depth of fear took shape when entire communities began to witness what happened to villages that could no longer meet the impossible expectations placed upon them. As quotas rose beyond what the land could provide and the people could endure, communities found themselves facing consequences far more devastating than the loss of crops or the exhaustion of labor. They began to learn, through whispers carried from one riverbank to another, that failure did not simply bring punishment upon individuals. It could bring destruction upon everyone who lived within a village's boundaries. The first signs were often distant columns of smoke rising above the trees, travelers returning with haunted expressions, or abandoned paths leading to places where homes once stood. People sensed that a new level of danger had emerged, one that did not distinguish between those who resisted and those who simply could not keep up. Over time, the stories grew more specific, and one of the most deeply etched into memory was the tragedy associated with Lusanga in 1895. It began like so many others, with rising demands that pushed the community to its limits. The villagers had tried, just as countless others had, to gather enough rubber to satisfy the agents who monitored their every move. They worked through scorching afternoons and sleepless nights, climbing trees until their hands were raw and crossing long stretches of forest with burdens far heavier than their bodies could manage. Yet the quotas remained out of reach, and the fear that hovered over everyone deepened until it became a constant presence. When the Force Publique finally arrived, the villagers had little left to give except pleas that would never be heard. What followed spread through the region not as a tale of rebellion or resistance, but as a warning of what could happen even when people tried their hardest to comply. The destruction of Lusanga sent ripples through the surrounding territories. Travelers passing by the region spoke of silent ruins where voices once filled the air, of cooking fires extinguished, and of paths leading into empty clearings that felt unnervingly still. Those who encountered the aftermath struggled to describe the sense of loss, because it was not only the disappearance of over 300 lives that scarred the land, but the erasure of an entire community's history. Fields that had once provided food lay untouched, homes were scattered in pieces, and the rhythm of daily life had been extinguished so completely that even the elders, who had experienced seasons of hardship before, found themselves unable to offer words of comfort. The land that surrounded Lusanga seemed to hold its breath, as though the forest itself recognized the magnitude of what had been taken. For villagers in distant regions, the story of Lusanga became an ever-present reminder that survival depended not on effort alone, but on forces far beyond their control. People worked with renewed urgency, pushing themselves harder than their bodies could bear, because the thought of losing family and home loomed larger than any physical pain. Communities created new warning systems, sending runners along riverbanks or through hidden forest trails to alert neighboring villages whenever patrols were seen nearby. Parents instructed their children on where to hide and how to stay silent, preparing them for moments they hoped would never come. Yet even these precautions brought little comfort, because the shadow cast by events like Lusanga reached into every decision, every gathering, and every night spent listening to the forest sounds with a heightened sense of dread. As the years passed, The memory of what happened there became woven into the collective consciousness of the region. A reminder of how fragile even the strongest communities could become under the weight of relentless demands. The villagers who survived carried the emotional scars into the future, telling fragments of the story in hushed tones so that generations to come would understand the depth of loss endured in those years. Lusanga became more than a place, it became a symbol of the consequences of a system built on domination. A testament to how far-reaching the devastation could be when entire villages were treated not as homes filled with people, but as numbers tied to quotas. The echoes of that tragedy lingered in the forests long after the smoke cleared, forever altering the way communities understood vulnerability, resilience, and the cost of being caught within a world shaped by distant powers. Long before the scars left by the destruction of villages had time to fade, another force began moving silently through the land, spreading in ways even the most vigilant communities could not evade. As people were driven from their homes, pushed into unfamiliar forests, or forced into crowded labor camps, illnesses that had once appeared sporadically now found the perfect conditions to take hold. The upheaval created by constant movement and fear disrupted traditional healing practices, broke the patterns of daily life that once kept communities healthy, and replaced stability with exhaustion. In this unsettled landscape, smallpox and sleeping sickness began to spread not as isolated outbreaks, but as a constant presence that crept from one region to another with unsettling speed. Those who lived through this period remembered how the first signs often appeared quietly. Someone who had worked tirelessly to keep up with the quotas would begin to feel weakened, attributing it to long days in the forest. And then a few days later, more people in the same household would fall ill. Communities accustomed to caring for their sick now found themselves unable to provide the attention needed, because everyone was caught between survival tasks and the fear of attracting unwanted attention. Mothers who once knew every herb in the forest found their knowledge insufficient when faced with diseases that spread faster than remedies could be prepared. Elders, who had guided their people through hardships before, watched old treatments fail under the strain of exhaustion and displacement. What had once been manageable became overwhelming when entire families were weakened at the same time. As sleeping sickness made its way along riverbanks and across regions where people were constantly being moved, it took advantage of the turmoil. Travelers described passing camps where once vibrant individuals now sat motionless under trees, too tired to speak, their bodies drained by an illness that seemed to deepen with every passing day. The land itself seemed to reflect the growing toll. Paths became quieter, fishing areas less crowded, and meeting places where stories had once been shared grew empty. The sounds of daily life, children playing, groups singing during evening gatherings, elders telling histories faded as illness and fear reshaped the rhythm of existence. Smallpox spread in a different but equally devastating pattern, moving quickly through groups who had little chance to avoid close contact. The constant arrival of soldiers, porters, and displaced villagers created a network through which the disease traveled from one settlement to the next. Communities that had managed to escape the violence found themselves unable to escape the illnesses that followed in its wake. Some families left their homes in the hope of avoiding infection, only to discover that fleeing brought new risks: lack of food, exposure to unfamiliar conditions, and encounters with other groups already weakened by disease. The forests that once offered refuge now held an unpredictable danger, and each journey carried the possibility of encountering illness rather than safety. The emotional weight of these outbreaks added another layer to the suffering. Parents watched their children fall ill at a time when even seeking assistance could draw unwanted attention from those enforcing quotas. People felt trapped between the fear of punishment and the fear of losing loved ones to sickness, creating a sense of helplessness that seeped into every decision. The memory of places like Lusanga lingered heavily, and for many communities, the arrival of a fever or unexplained fatigue carried the same dread as the sight of approaching patrols. The sense of being hunted by both visible and invisible forces shaped the way people viewed their world. heightening the understanding that danger could strike from many directions. In the years that followed, the stories of illness became intertwined with the memories of violence, forming a narrative of loss that was not limited to direct confrontation, but extended into every corner of life. Entire generations were marked not only by the destruction of villages, but by the quiet devastation of disease that flourished under the harsh conditions imposed on them. Those who survived carried the memories of these illnesses as part of the broader struggle they had endured, remembering how the land itself seemed to dim under the weight of suffering. And as time moved forward, the spread of disease became one more reminder of how deeply the upheaval had disrupted the fabric of community life, transforming everyday existence in ways that would echo through the region long after the immediate crisis had passed. As the illnesses spread and the patterns of life in the region continued to unravel, news of what was happening did not stay confined within the Congo's borders. Stories carried by traders, missionaries, and occasional travelers made their way to distant ports, where they were recounted with a mixture of disbelief and unease. Yet it was one thing to hear rumors whispered in taverns or printed in obscure columns, and another to confront evidence so undeniable that even those who had long admired Leopold's public persona could no longer look away. That turning point began with individuals who refused to accept the official narrative, choosing instead to investigate the truth hidden beneath layers of carefully crafted claims. One of these individuals was Edmund Morel, a young clerk whose job should have involved nothing more than keeping track of cargo and paperwork at the docks. Yet day after day he watched ships arrive from the Congo loaded with valuable goods while returning with almost nothing. For someone trained to read patterns, the imbalance made no sense unless the opposite cargo, human labor, was never being paid for in any legitimate way. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that something deeply troubling lay behind the polished reports that described progress and prosperity. The quiet tension of discovery pushed him to dig further, and each new piece of information he uncovered added weight to his growing determination to bring the truth to light. At the same time, Casement, whose work had already taken him to distant parts of the world, was appointed to carry out an official investigation. When he traveled through the region, he did not rely on second-hand accounts but spoke directly with those who had witnessed events firsthand. He walked through villages still marked by recent hardships, listened to the stories of families who had endured unimaginable losses, and took careful note of conditions that had been hidden from outside scrutiny. His observations were not collected hastily. He understood that each detail mattered, that the world needed an account grounded in direct experience rather than rumor. As he continued his journey, the full weight of what he was documenting began to form a picture far more severe than anyone outside the region had imagined. Back in Europe, Morel's work grew into a mission that would consume the rest of his life. Using his skills as a writer and organizer, he began publishing articles, giving public talks, and forming groups dedicated to raising awareness. People who might never have paid attention to events in Central Africa found themselves confronted with a steady flow of evidence presented in a calm but uncompromising manner. Morel understood the importance of persistence, knowing that pushing against a widely accepted narrative required not only passion but endurance. His efforts slowly gathered support from activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens who felt compelled to respond once the truth was laid before them. Casement's report, when completed, provided a detailed account that left little room for doubt. Written with the restraint of an official document, yet carrying the weight of human stories, it offered a clear and measured description of the conditions he had witnessed. The report traveled quickly through the diplomatic circles of Europe, unsettling governments and challenging assumptions about colonial rule. Even those who had previously defended Leopold's policies found themselves reconsidering their views in the face of such carefully gathered evidence. The words of the report echoed far beyond the corridors of power, sparking conversations in homes, newspapers, and lecture halls. Together, Morel and Casement created a wave of awareness that reached across oceans, connecting the experiences of villagers in remote forests with the debates of lawmakers in distant capitals. Their work shifted global opinion and forced the question of responsibility into public consciousness. The once hidden events in the Congo became part of an international discussion, moving steadily from the margins to the center of political attention. And in the years that followed, their efforts played a crucial role in reshaping how the world viewed imperial claims, reminding people that accountability depended not only on those in power but also on those willing to seek out the truth and share it, even when doing so required immense personal courage. As the reports circulated and conversations intensified across Europe and beyond, the pressure surrounding Leopold's administration grew heavier with each passing month. What had once been spoken of as a distant territorial venture wrapped in noble language was now recognized as a system that had inflicted profound suffering. And the contrast between the king's public statements and the evidence presented by those who had witnessed the situation firsthand had become impossible to ignore. Diplomats found themselves questioned by journalists. Citizens challenged the speeches of officials. And the glow of admiration that had once surrounded Leopold's overseas project dimmed under the weight of undeniable testimony. The world had begun to shift, and that shift carried with it a demand for action rather than silence. Governments that had previously hesitated to interfere now faced pressure from their own populations, as well as from advocacy groups spreading information more rapidly than ever before. Public meetings filled with people who wanted answers. Newspapers printed new findings with a clarity that made evasion difficult. And political leaders realized that maintaining alliances required addressing the growing sense of moral unease. While Leopold continued to defend his role and insisted that his intentions had always been guided by progress and advancement, those claims no longer held the convincing power they once did. Instead, they stood in sharp contrast to the detailed accounts emerging from the region. Accounts that revealed strain, loss, and the profound impact of policies imposed from afar. By the time Belgium convened its own committees to examine the matter, the international conversation had already grown too loud to contain. Every new inquiry produced more evidence that contradicted the official image Leopold had spent years cultivating, and the distance between appearance and reality became a subject of debate in parliaments and public squares. Belgian lawmakers realized that the continuation of a privately controlled territory under such scrutiny posed risks not only to the nation's reputation but also to its political stability. The king's personal rule, once presented as a symbol of ambition and pride, had become a source of discomfort that could no longer be ignored. When Belgium eventually moved to assume control in 1908, it did so under the combined weight of diplomatic insistence, public demand, and the steady work of those who had brought the truth into the open. Leopold relinquished the territory not through voluntary reform, but through necessity. And the moment was marked by a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Many hoped that the transfer would bring meaningful change, believing that placing the region under national administration, rather than the authority of a single individual, might lead to greater accountability. Yet the deep structural inequalities already embedded within the colony did not disappear simply because administrative power had shifted. Families who had endured years of hardship found that the rhythms of daily life did not transform overnight. Infrastructure built through forced labor remained as a reminder of the past. And communities continued to navigate systems that had been shaped long before Belgium's official takeover. Though the intensity of coercion lessened in some areas, the economic pressures and political hierarchies that defined the colonial relationship persisted. Those who worked the land or transported goods still operated under rules they had no voice in creating, and the promise of reform arrived slowly, often overshadowed by the priorities of distant decision-makers. Nevertheless, the transfer marked a critical turning point in global awareness. The world had learned that even powerful rulers could be challenged when evidence was brought forward with persistence and courage. and the story of how the truth emerged became as significant as the events themselves. The Congo did not suddenly enter a new era of freedom or equality, but the shift laid the groundwork for future movements that would push back against systems of domination, in the echoes of public debates, in the written reports that refused to fade, and in the voices of those who continued to demand recognition. A different trajectory began to take shape, one in which the experiences of the people living through these changes slowly gained the attention they had long been denied. The legacy of figures like Simon Kimbangu and Patrice Lumumba stands as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, resistance endures. Kimbangu's spiritual movement challenged the belief that Africans were destined to remain subjects, insisting instead that dignity and faith could not be crushed by colonial violence. Decades later, Lumumba carried that same fire into the political arena, his voice defiant, fearless, and uncompromising, shook the structures of European dominance and helped shape Congo's path toward independence. Their stories mark a turning point. For generations, Congolese communities had been silenced by forced labor, amputations, mass killings, and an economic system designed to extract everything while giving nothing in return. Under Leopold, the Congo Free State became one of the most brutal colonial regimes in modern history, an empire built on rubber, ivory, and human lives. But the people who survived it refused to disappear into footnotes. They held on to memory, identity, and faith. And slowly, courage began to spread. Independence did not arrive as a gift. It was the result of countless uprisings, hidden acts of defiance, and leaders who paid the ultimate price. Lumumba's assassination showed the world that colonial interests did not vanish overnight. They simply changed shape. Yet even in martyrdom, Lumumba's influence grew. He became a symbol of African unity, self-determination, and the ongoing fight against exploitation, whether political, economic, or ideological. Today, Congo continues to face challenges: conflict, foreign interference, and the struggle to reclaim resources that still attract global powers. But modern movements, activists, historians, and ordinary citizens are rebuilding the narrative. They are ensuring that the truth about Leopold's atrocities is no longer hidden, that the suffering of millions is acknowledged, and that Congo's rich cultural heritage is celebrated rather than erased. When we revisit these stories, we are not only honoring the victims, we are recognizing the resilience of a nation that refused to accept the identity imposed on it by colonizers. Congo's journey from terror and forced labor to independence and ongoing resistance reminds us that history is not just about the past. It shapes our present, influences our institutions, and challenges us to stand against injustice today. The story you just heard is not an easy one, but it is necessary. Understanding the truth is the first step toward preventing such horrors from ever happening again anywhere. And by telling these stories, we help restore the dignity that oppression tried so hard to destroy. Thank you for watching, and thank you for choosing to learn about a chapter of history that the world often tries to forget. If you found this video meaningful, insightful, or eye-opening, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support helps keep important stories alive and allows us to continue bringing hidden history to light. Together, we make sure that the voices of the past are never silenced again.